Okay, I think I have removed all the embarrassing things from my room. Coffee, Plato, comfy pants. Let's do this. So, last time we saw that the Republic started off with this question about justice. Namely, why is it better to be just rather than unjust? And the two main challenges that we got were that the first one was from Thrasymachus, who said that justice is primarily a matter of whoever happens to be in power, and they just set up the rules to their own advantage. So if that's what justice is, why should we care about what the people in power say? They're just looking out for themselves. Why should I care about that? And the second challenge we got was from Glaucon and Adeimantus, and their main idea was that actually it's better to appear to be just so that people think that you're just, so that you don't have to suffer the negative consequences of unjust actions like being punished or having your friends ostracize you. But in fact, if you can get away with it, you should probably try. And what Socrates is going to do is respond to these challenges. Now, how exactly he responds to the challenge has been a matter of great controversy. It's something that has baffled and inspired people for literally millennia. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the structure of the response. And it starts off from this idea that what justice is in the soul, what it is for a person to be just, in order to work out that question, we have to look at what a perfectly just city is. And again, this is strange. It's not obvious that to think about what it means to be an individually just person has anything to do with what a perfectly just city is. But this is the strategy of the Republic. In order to get a handle on what it is to be a just person, we have to look to the ideally just city. The investigation we're undertaking is not an easy one, but requires keen eyesight. Therefore, since we aren't clever people, we should adopt the method of investigation that would use if, lacking keen eyesight, we were told to read small letters from a distance, and then notice that the same letters existed elsewhere in a larger size and on a larger surface. We'd consider it a godsend, I think, to be allowed to read the larger ones first, and then to examine the smaller ones, and to see whether they really are the same. That's certainly true, said Adeimantus, but how is this case similar to our investigation of justice? I'll tell you. We say, don't we, that there is the justice of a single man, and also the justice of a whole city. Certainly. And a city is larger than a single man. It is larger. Perhaps then there is more justice in the larger thing, and it will be easier to learn what it is. So if you're willing, let's first find out what sort of thing justice is in a city, and afterwards look for it in the individual, observing the ways in which the smaller is similar to the larger. So what Socrates notices is that in the way that we talk about a just person, and we also talk about a just city or a just society. And Socrates' thought is, well, maybe there's some connection between how we talk about justice in a city, or how we talk about justice in a society, and how we talk about justice in a person. And because cities are bigger and it might be somehow clearer, we might get a clearer idea or a better grasp on what justice is in society and in the city first. And then we can answer the harder question of what it is to be a just person and why we should care about that. So the strategy is to start from what is hopefully an easier example, and then use that to explain the harder example. So we'll start from justice in the city, and then we'll see if that has a relationship to justice in the soul. So what Socrates then does is engages in this kind of thought experiment. What would it take if we were to start up a city from scratch? If we were to make a community, what would we need to have? What would people need to do? And what's interesting about this is from the get-go, Socrates introduces this important principle that's going to inform a lot about what he thinks justice is in the city. And that's the principle of specialization. Think of it this way. Imagine you and a bunch of friends are going out camping in the Rocky Mountains. And you're like way out into the wilderness and you're going to be out there for about a week or so. So big camping trip. Now one thing you could do when you first arrive is that each of you could set up your own tent, each of you could cook your own food, and each of you could go out and see what fun things there might be to do in the area. Now, there are two reasons why people don't actually do this. Firstly, it's wildly inefficient for each person to cook their own food, and wildly inefficient for each person to go out and basically double up on tasks. So what you would want to do is you want to divide up the roles. One person will do the cooking, another person will set up the tents, and the third person will go out and look for things to do in the area. The other reason that most people will split up the jobs this way is it's not the case that everybody is equally good at all things. One person might have a terrible sense of direction, so if they were the one who went out to look for things to do in the area, they would get lost and maybe get attacked by a bear. Similarly, not everyone's equally good at cooking. If there's one person in your group who's a really good cook, then you should probably get them to stay back and do the cooking, and get another person who's good at following instructions to put up the tents. And in that way, everyone's going to be better off overall if you divide up the tasks. This is called the principle of specialization, the idea that there's one job for one person. Each person only does one job. And it's the principle that Socrates uses to set up the ideal city. What he's going to do is show that actually everybody's going to be better off, and there's going to be higher quality products, and everyone's going to be happier if we stick to this principle of specialization. So instead of people jumping around where everybody tries to do a little bit of everything, where you try to make your own shoes, and you try to protect the city yourself, and you try to run the city yourself, instead what we're going to do is we're going to divide up the jobs so that the people who are best suited for particular jobs are going to be the ones who do those jobs. And what about this? Must each of the craftspeople contribute his own work for the common use of all? For example, will a farmer provide food for everyone, spending quadruple the time and labor to provide food to be shared by them all? Or will he not bother about that, producing 1/4 the food and 1/4 the time, and spending the other 3/4, one in building a house, one in the production of his clothes, and one in making shoes, not troubling to associate with the others, but minding his own business on his own? Perhaps, Socrates, Adimantus replied, the way you suggested first would be easier than the other. That certainly wouldn't be surprising, for even as you were speaking, it occurred to me that, in the first place, we aren't all born alike, but each of us differs somewhat in nature from the others, one being suited to one task, another to another. Or don't you think so? Oh, I do. Second, does one person do a better job if he practices many crafts? Or, since he's one person himself, if he practices one? If he practices one, it's clear at any rate, I think, that if one misses the right moment in anything, the work is spoiled. It is. That's because the thing to be done won't wait on the leisure of the doer, but the doer must of necessity pay close attention to his work, rather than treating it as a secondary occupation. Yes, he must. The result, then, is that the more plentiful and better quality goods are more easily produced if each person does one thing for which he is naturally suited, does it at the right time, and is released from having to do any of the others. Now, there are a few things just to get clear about this passage. The first one that people sometimes trip up on is this idea of nature, that you can be born suited to a particular task. And this is going to be a theme that comes up a few times in the Republic, so it's worth taking the time now just to get clear on what Plato means by this. It doesn't mean, for example, that you're born destined to be a doctor. That seems like a bit of a stretch. Rather, what we're going to see is that the people who are going to be the ones who are assigned to being doctors are the ones who have a natural ability for something. Namely, they take to it quickly, and most importantly, they enjoy doing it. It's the kind of thing which they're happy to put time and practice into. So to take a really easy example, I am not someone who's naturally suited for doing mathematics. Now, I worked hard at it at school, and I got good grades in my mathematics classes, but it was a struggle. it doesn't matter like how much time and effort I put into it, it never felt like it came smoothly. Whereas music, on the other hand, I really enjoyed. I liked playing the piano. I liked practicing. My sister, it was a struggle. My parents had to force her to try to practice, and of course she gave it up as soon as my parents stopped forcing her. Or is it something that I did of my own accord? In that sense, I'm more naturally fitted to music than I am naturally fitted to mathematics. If we were thinking about what kinds of roles we should assign if I was in this city, it seems like it would be better to assign me the job of a musician than to assign me the job of a mathematician or someone who had to work with numbers a lot. Again, it's not that I couldn't get good at it. It's not that I was somehow inborn as a musician rather than a mathematician. It's just that you could tell from how much time and how much I enjoyed a particular activity that I was more naturally fitted to one thing than another. The second theme that we saw in that passage was this idea that if one person does one thing, they'll be able to produce higher quality goods than if they try to do 4 things. And again, this is a really straightforward point. The thing that you practice the most is the thing that you're going to be the best at. There's now the kind of common adage that you have to spend 10,000 hours at something in order to be an expert at it. And it's that same kind of idea that Plato has noticed, and it's one that he's taken from his society. And again, think about it this way. If you're wanting to buy a violin, you don't go to someone who makes violins as a hobby. You go to someone who's a professional violin maker. Because we know that it's a complicated task, and we know that it requires skill and training. So what we want to do is we want to go to someone who's dedicated the time to it. There's going to be a higher quality goods if we do it that way. And again, it's related to the first point about nature as well. Someone's just not going to put in the hours into their skill, into their craft, unless they enjoy it, unless they have a nature fitted for that thing. Again, think about my sister. She was never going to be a concert pianist because she never enjoyed practicing. She doesn't have a nature that's fitted for piano playing. Now, of course, she found something else that she's very good at, and so she spent her time putting in the effort to that, and now she's an expert at her particular thing. So again, we see 2 elements relating. The first is you have to have a nature fitted for the task, and then you just have to put in the hours. If you want to have really high quality products, if you want to be an expert or skilled at something, you have to put in the time. You have to practice at it. Now, what's even the point of doing ancient philosophy if we don't occasionally talk about Sparta and the movie 300? Of course, that is not a historical documentary. You should not use it as a source in your papers. But one of the scenes I do really like in that movie is one which is based on a historical account. What happens in the scene is that Leonidas, the leader of the Spartans, brings his 300 soldiers to meet with the rest of the Greek army. And the rest of the Greek army vastly outnumbers the Spartans, and they say, "Why did you bring so few soldiers?" And Leonidas points to one of the soldiers and says, "Man, what is your profession?" And he says, "I'm a potter." And he points to another person and says, "What is your profession?" And he says, "I'm a shoemaker." And then he looks back to the Spartans and says, "Spartans, what is your profession?" And they all hold up their spears and chant. And then Leonidas says to the other general, "See, I brought more soldiers than you did." And the thought's supposed to be the Spartans had trained to be soldiers since they were young. They're soldiers in the true sense of the word, whereas these other people had been practicing other crafts. They weren't soldiers, they were shoemakers and craftsmen. And so, of course, the reason that the Spartan warriors were so much better than the other Greek warriors at this point is because they had training. They were the people who had practiced this. And it's that idea that Plato is picking up on when he's wanting to found the ideal city on the idea of the principle of specialization. We want people who are trained at the jobs that they do, so that they'll be the ones who are experts, they'll be the ones who are skilled, and so they'll be the ones who are producing the goods. This will make the city run better overall, it'll be better organized, and people will be fitted to the tasks that they're suited for. We prevented a cobbler from trying to be a farmer, weaver, or builder at the same time, and said that he must remain a cobbler in order to produce fine work. And each of the others, too, was to work all his life at a single trade for which he had a natural aptitude, and keep away from all the others, so as not to miss the right moment to practice his own work well. Now, isn't it of the greatest importance that warfare be practiced well? And fighting a war so easy that a farmer or a cobbler or any other craftsman can be a soldier at the same time? Though no one can become so much as a good player of checkers or dice if he considers it only as a sideline and doesn't practice it from childhood. Or can someone pick up a shield or any other weapon or tool of war and immediately perform adequately in an infantry battle or any other kind? No other tool makes anyone who picks it up a craftsman or champion, unless he has acquired the requisite knowledge and has had sufficient practice. If tools could make anyone who picked them up an expert, that'd be valuable indeed. This later passage includes the third element, which is going to be really important for Plato's setting up of the ideal city, and which also falls out of the principle of specialization. And that's the idea that someone who has a nature fitted for a task and who dedicates their life to practicing it is going to have knowledge at the end of that process. The thought's supposed to be knowledge is a really important component of why we consider someone an expert. Again, why it is that we want specialist doctors and why it is that we want specialist lawyers is because we think that there's a kind of knowledge that they need to acquire and that takes a long time and a lot of training to get. But once they've acquired that knowledge, it also improves the quality of their practice and gives them a kind of authority to judge on those matters. So there are three elements that actually end up going into Plato's conception of skill or expertise: nature, training, and knowledge. And it's these three elements that are going to come together, and why it is that each person in the ideal city is going to have each of those things for the task that they're suited for. The next stage of the Republic, then, is dedicated to filling out this idea of the ideally just city. And he imagines this city called Callipolis, which just means the fine or the beautiful city. And what Plato's going to do is he's going to apply the principle of specialization in order to make the city as good as possible. And what we find is that the just city has three classes of people, each of which have their own particular roles and have their own particular functions that, again, they're fitted for, that they specialize at, and that they have knowledge of. The lowest class is what gets called the producers. These are the people who are responsible for making sure that there are clothes, making sure that there are food. Again, most of these people are farmers and basic craftspeople and artisans. Then there's the second class of citizens, which gets called the auxiliaries. These are the soldiers. They're responsible for being trained in the military. They're basically responsible for making sure that the city stays safe from external threats, and that any internal threats are quickly removed. So in that sense, they're kind of like soldiers and police officers at the same time. Then there's the third class of citizens. These are the people who get called the guardians. They're the philosophers and they're also the rulers. These are people who are trained to have a particular kind of knowledge of justice and goodness, and are the people who run the city. So those are the three classes of the city, and what we're going to see later on is that they have a parallel with the three parts of the soul. But for now, what you just need to know is that there are these three roles in the city, and that they're assigned on the basis of the principle of specialization. And next time, we'll talk about how this maps on to the three parts of the soul, by looking at how it is that each of the parts of the city are trained, and how it is that they're educated. Namely, how it is that they practice to become skilled at their particular crafts. And what we'll see is that this is going to reveal a lot about how Plato's thinking about human psychology.